Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. We wanted to briefly talk about some methodological issues when it comes to hadith, especially in the minhaj of the Mu'tazila, which had a big impact on those that came after them, like the school of Imam Abil Hasan al-Ashari, especially the later day Ash'ara. They began to take more and more of the approach of the Mu'tazila in hadith. But here we want to focus mostly on understanding three orientations that we find among the school of I'tizal or the Mu'tazila. And also we wanted to say that this same problem is coming up with some of the Muslim academics that are in the Western university system in the way that they're approaching a hadith. So Dr. Hassan al-Shafi'i, who's one of the great scholars of ilm al-kalam in today's time, he, in his piece entitled من قضايا المنهج في علم الكلام, issues of methodology in the school of Kalam or in the circle of Kalam, he mentions that the Mu'tazila, when it comes to ahadith, we find some methodological positions that were taken, and we see that they vary as well. Not in terms of being completely opposed, but we begin to see that they vary in terms of depth of commitment. What that means, if we rewind back a little, is that one of the issues that presented itself in the past was what is the role of the intellect or dalil al-aqli, the rational proof, in relation to a dalil al-sam'i or dalil al-naqli, in relation toward basically the Quran and the Sunnah and ijma' as well. What is the scale that each type of proof is weighed? Is it a scale of balance or a scale of excess tipping in one direction over the other? The argument that is made by Dr. Hassan al-Shafi'i is a very interesting argument. And the point that he makes is that in the madhab of the Salaf, you find that there was among people like Hassan al-Basri and Jafar bin Sadiq, as well as Abu Hanifa and Thawri and others, a balance between the usage of the rational proof and the transmitted proof or revelation and reason. He states من عمة السلف كالحسن البصري وجعفر الصادق وأبي حنيفة والثوري وغيرهم قد استند هؤلاء الأئمة في بيان الأحكام الاعتقادية على الكتاب والسنة أولا، ثم على العقل والرأي بعد ذلك، أي على كل من الدليل النقلي والدليل العقلي معا، مع الاعتداد أساسا بالأول منهما. So in his characterization of the madhab of the Salaf, in this iteration of it, meaning that there was this group of people among the Salaf in the past, like Hassan al-Basri, Jafar al-Sadiq, Abi Hanifa al-Thawri, and others, that they went to the scale of measuring intellectual proofs and transmitted proofs, they went to the scale of balance. So you found not only did they go to the scale of balance, but they gave a distinct, unique position to revelation. So you find first that they establish points in Aqida by way of revelation, and then they referred to intellect, to rationale, to reasoning, and so on and so forth after that, while giving a special emphasis and an inclination towards the foundational proof of the book and the Sunnah. With time, he says, لما جاء المعتزلة رفعوا من مكانة العقل وكادوا يسوون بينهما وبين النص تماما كما يستفاد من كلام شيخهم واصل. So then you found that with the time of Wasl bin Atta, there was a slight shift that took place. It was mentioned that rational proofs were found among these scholars of the Salaf. But ultimately, revelation is what was central. And there was a special type of reason that they engaged in. It was not equivalent to the usage of the philosophy of Aristotle and the logic of Aristotle and incorporating that system into reasoning in the Kalam school. But one of, like you see, especially in the later stages of I'tizal, where this becomes very clear, and then in the Ash'ari school to some extent. The Mu'tazila, they began to push forward the intellectual proof, even though at the beginning Imam Wasl held the two to be of equal weight, so to speak. Except that the tendency in the school of I'tizal or the Mu'tazila began to lean more and more heavily towards intellectual proofs to the point where the proof that's transmitted became less important in their thinking, and then eventually you see that they attempt to move more and more towards pure reason. But this comes in stages and in degrees, and there's different manifestations of I'tizal, different manifestations of the school of the Mu'tazila, and different degrees of this practice of putting the intellectual proof before the transmitted proof. And he says, قد تعلوا على منزلة الدليل السمعي وإن ظلوا يعتمدون عليهما معا على الدليل العقلي والدليل النقلي مع تحديد المجال الذي يقبل فيه كل منهما. So this is something that's very important that's not talked about, because a lot of times we talk in generalities without nuance. And that is that in this earlier phase, we began to see that there were some areas of knowledge which were left to be the realm in which one proof dominated over another. So when it came, for instance, to issues of al-ghaybat or al-ghayb, the issues of the unseen, in those types of matters, it's not easy to establish a claim solely on rational proof. So you find that in that type of scenario, there's more of a leaning, or that area of knowledge, there's more of a leaning towards transmitted proofs, like to talk about the angels and description of the angels and so on and so forth, that type of thing. But when it comes, for instance, to proving the existence of God, or when it comes to proving the oneness of God, then you begin to see more of an inclination towards the rational side. And that's become very clear within the school of Kalam, that that's the direction that he took. But one of the things that Dr. Hassan al-Shafi'i mentions, and this is going to bring us to where we want to be at in this conversation, and we come to an end. He says, يشمل الدليل السمعي عند المعتزلة ثلاثة أمور. That what constitutes the transmitted proof, or the proof of revelation, is three sources pretty much, right? And that is the Quran, ijma', and the mutawatir narration, or what is termed as the mashhur, which for the students of Hadith, the mashhur narration has a special distinct place, and especially in the school of al-mutaqaddimin, in the earlier generation, mashhur has a certain type of definition that comes very close to mutawatir, similar to what we find in the Hanafi madhab, that before getting to what we call khabar al-ahad or khabar al-wahid, al-khabar al-ahad, actually, we should keep it in that way to be a little more precise in our statements. This type of narration, in between it and the mutawatir, there was a median narration, which didn't exactly meet the conditions of mutawatir, but also didn't meet the conditions of ahad. We find that especially in the Hanafi school, and in some of the scholars in the past, in their thinking, the mashhur narration was up there, sometimes even overlapping with the mutawatir. And there's a lot to be said in that regard. But in any event, when we talk about the minhaj of hadith, when it comes to minhaj al-ittizal, or the methodology of the Mu'tazila, they limited the dalil sam'i, the transmitted proof that was to be used in Aqida, to three: the Quran, ijma', and the mutawatir narration, or the mashhur. And some attribute this to be the position of Wasil bin Ata, right? So the Quran was central to all of the firaq in one way or another, right? But what we begin to see, that they begin to extend the usage and the reliance on what we call ta'wil, right? فأما القرآن فإنهم جميعا يعتمدون عليه بتعبية الحال ولكن أسرافهم في استخدام سلح التعويل. So ta'wil became the way that the book of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala was reorganized and repurposed and realigned in their systematic reflections. That's something that has to be really considered and looked at, right? And so a lot of this ended with a continuous going against the apparent meanings of the Quran, right? With the intent of saying that we have to be inclining towards tanzih, or we have to absolve from, or we have to purify from our thinking the idea, any idea that Allah has human qualities or has anthropomorphic qualities. So the idea, the madhab of the eminence, the transcendence of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, it became very dominant to the point of forcing those ahadith which made it seem like Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is eminent, or has characteristics which can be interpreted as human characteristics, but unlike human characteristics, right? So here we see يدعوهم إلى مخالفة ظواهر النصوص القرآنية غالبا بحجية التنزيه, the ta'wil. Ta'wil forced them into that, or ta'wil called them to go against the apparent meanings of the Quran, based on the idea of the transcendence of God from the creation. right? And so here, from the models that support that thesis that this was their school, is their position on the ru'ya of Allah tabarak wa ta'ala in the hereafter. The Mu'tazila denied that. And Dr. Hassan Shafi says what says صفات الخبرية كاليد والاستواء ونحوها وصرفهم إياها إلى معان أخرى. So he says that the Mu'tazila also, when it came to صفات الخبرية, such as the idea of the yad wal istiwa, and I'm going to leave it at that. I want to translate that, and other sifat that fall under this category of khabariyah, that led them to interpret the linguistic meanings of these terms that are found in the Quran that were known among the Arabs to be something else. So ta'wil, or interpretation in this case, became the sword by which they empowered themselves and supported their madhab. They also denied وأما فقد شكك النظام في وقوعه. وأما الإجماع فقد شكك النظام في وقوعه وهجيته وجاوز إجماع الأمة على الباطل. So is attributed to Nizam, was one of the Mu'tazila thinkers, that the position of Ijma', he doubted in its possibility of being enacted or taking place, and in its nature as a proof. But he allowed that the Ummah is possible to agree upon falsehood, which is not the position of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Now we come to the point of the minhaj of the Mu'tazila in Hadith. وأما الحديث فيبدو أن واصل لم يقبل إلا المتواتر والمشهور من الأخبار. So Wasil, we go with the madhab of Wasil here, Wasil bin Atta, it states that what is apparent, or what it appears to be the case in his school, is that he only accepts the mutawatir narration and the mashhur. And then after him, Amr bin Ubaid began to doubt in narrations and narrators, to the point that he differed with his sheikh, and also inclined in that direction was Abu Hudayl. In what direction? That the mutawatir is a proof, and the mashhur and the khabar al-wahid, it doesn't afford us any knowledge. Is subject to doubt. Is subject to the possibility of doubt. And the position that's attributed to Nizam is that he denied overall or rejected the proof of the mutawatir narration. And that's what we see the problem with the academy is, right? Especially that position of Nizam. Just the doubting of hadith as a proof overall to be able to stand to the strictures of the university, it's a very Mu'tazili position. And so we see that these various shades of i'tizal, or these various colors of the school of the Mu'tazila, they contribute to various methodological stances in regards to hadith and in regards to how it is that the proof of the Quran and the Sunnah is used. And these stances that are taken make up a foundation for ilm al-kalam in its earliest stages, which then is inherited in great part by the Ashari school. And we see these types of issues come up. And these types of issues, when they come up, of course, they lead to different positions to be taken on the names and attributes of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, and even on the role of Hadith in Aqida. But it's important to understand that it was the Mu'tazila that shifted the type and way that of reason that was used in the early discussions on ilm al-kalam. And not only did they shift the way that reason was used, they also gave reason a role that was unprecedented in the madhab of the Salaf. In the madhab of the Salaf. And eventually this impacted ilm al-kalam greatly, and we see in the Ashari school massive debates on these issues. Even to the point where it overflows into fiqh discussions. Did Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi deny the use of khabar al-ahad in some cases? Did Malik deny the use of khabar al-ahad in some cases? And there's debates in usul al-fiqh on this stuff. But in any event, these are some of the root causes, these stances on interpreting the Quran in certain areas and on accepting the Hadith that lead to differences of position and orientation in Aqida, and differentiate the school of Hadith from the school of Kalam and even the madhab of the Salaf with its various shades and dimensions from what we begin to see with the rise of I'tizal and what comes thereafter. With this we end. We ask Allah to forgive us and to aid us and to protect us. And if there's any mistake that I've made, those mistakes are from myself. And we ask Allah to preserve us and preserve our understanding and to aid us. ونستغفر الله ونتوب إليه والعصر إن الإنسان في خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.